We're living in a world that more than ever demands we get off the sidelines and do something for the public good. Or as the late iconic civil rights leader John Lewis said, never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Our guests today have met that call to action with fearlessness and the resolve to make a difference. And they have. Joining us are Sarah McBride, state senator from Delaware, Mallory McMorrow, state senator from Michigan, Kyle Spencer, author of Raising Them Right, the untold story of America's ultra-conservative youth movement and its plot for power. Shannon Watts, founder of the gun safety organization Moms Demand Action. And later on, we'll meet Melanie DeMoore, a true believer in the power of vocal activism. But first, welcome to our panel. Shannon, after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando that killed 49 people, John Lewis staged a sit-in in the House chamber, and he said, time for being quiet is over. We've got to move our feet. We've got to make noise. Meanwhile, 10 years ago, you're sitting in Indiana as a stay-at-home mom of 5 children, and suddenly you decide to change your life and start to make some noise and move your feet to take a stand against gun violence. Why was that something you had to do?
You know, I'm not sure I knew actually that I was doing that. I had spent about 15 years in the corporate world. I was taking a 5-year break because I was blending my husband and my families. We have 5 children altogether. And I was folding laundry in my bedroom the day of the horrific mass shooting at Sandy Hook School in Newtown, Connecticut. And like everyone in America, I was just devastated that 20 children and 6 educators were slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. And I went to bed that night in tears, and I woke up the next day just completely full of rage. I was so angry that this was happening in our country. And I thought to myself, there's got to be something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for gun safety in this country. And I'll just get online and I'll join that. And I went online and I searched and I found think tanks mostly run by men. And I found one-off city and state organizations also mostly run by men. I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. That's who I've seen get so much done in this country over and over again for over a century. And so I just started a Facebook page thinking I would have that conversation with other women. I had about 75 Facebook friends. And obviously, so many other women and moms had that same idea that day because my post went viral. And what I thought was going to be an online conversation became Moms Demand Action for gun sense in America. We are the largest grassroots movement in the country. And with 10 million supporters, we're actually now twice as large as the NRA.
Applause line. So you build this political juggernaut. A lot of people get angry. You get out there and you do something and you build this political juggernaut where you take on the NRA and the gun makers and the politicians who serve the interests of both, and you start winning. But you also have changed your life, and it's impacted your family, and you've gotten death threats, and you've had to go along with what all of us, the pain and suffering of watching so much inaction over so much time. What kept you going throughout 10 years?
I mean, some of it was naivete, honestly. I never imagined that there was this underbelly of America that existed. I was sort of living in a bubble. And, you know, the threats of death and sexual violence began immediately to myself and to my family. And I think that not just me, but the volunteers in this organization, many of whom were showing up at events and they were surrounded by men with semi-automatic rifles. You know, we had to make a decision. We were either going to back down or we were going to double down. And I think what we realized was, you know, if we lose our children, if we lose our loved ones, if people in our communities are being killed, we really have nothing left to lose. And, you know, I personally just refuse to be silenced and intimidated by extremists. I think at the end of the day that activism will always trump extremism. And I've seen it again and again. You know, we have a 90% track record of stopping the NRA's agenda every year for the last 7 years in state houses across the country. We've passed hundreds of good gun bills. We've sent secure storage notification materials home with 8 million families. I mean, if the people watching this take away nothing else, it needs to be that we are winning. I think it is slow but steady change, and I have learned over the last decade that it's really incrementalism that leads to revolutions.
Turning to Mallory at this point, you catapulted onto the national stage for speaking out against hate speech last year when you denounced a political opponent who accused you of wanting to groom and sexualize children. Here's part of your video that went viral, which so far has like over 16 million hits on Twitter. Here it is.
I didn't expect to wake up yesterday to the news that the senator from the 22nd district had overnight accused me by name of grooming and sexualizing children in an email fundraising for herself. So who am I? I am a straight, white, Christian, married, suburban mom who knows that the very notion that learning about slavery or redlining or systemic racism somehow means that children are being taught to feel bad or hate themselves because they are white is absolute nonsense. I want every child in this state to feel seen, heard, and supported, not marginalized and targeted because they are not straight, white, and Christian. We cannot let hateful people tell you otherwise to scapegoat and deflect from the fact that they are not doing anything to fix the real issues that impact people's lives. And I know that hate will only win if people like me stand by and let it happen.
So many people have felt those feelings. They're not as articulate as you are. You became an instant, I don't want to say sensation because that sort of doesn't really capture the gravity of it. Why do you think you got the reaction you got?
I mean, first, to be very clear, I was angry. I was livid. The idea that, just to kind of paint a picture of what happened, I woke up on a normal Monday morning and started doing my job, and my husband texted me a screenshot of a report on Twitter of this email that my colleague had sent out about me, accusing me by name of wanting to groom and sexualize kindergartners. I don't know how anybody could not be angry.
Right.
And I think in this moment, there was a lot that led up to my response, but that night, I went about my entire day, and there were a couple of kind of key things that happened. One, I was visiting a high school in my district and meeting, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, meet and greet with your state senator, which is usually not controversial at all. It's, what is your job? Do you have any internships? And those kinds of questions. But there was a girl who asked, she said, I'm queer. Why do all these bills targeting us keep moving, and why does my state hate me? And then that night, I was bathing my daughter, who's now 2, she was 1 at the time. And I just remember looking at her and her laughing at me because she's oblivious and she has no idea. And I just started crying and recognized that for this 15-year-old girl and for my daughter, this is not okay. It's not okay to demonize and target other people, that I was fine. I'm not actually the target of this attack, but my daughter might be, and this 15-year-old girl definitely is, because this attack says that if you are queer, you are wrong. And it's not okay. And I was in a position to be able to do something about it. But I think that for too long, especially for women, we've been told we can't show emotion and we can't be angry. And I was in my community the day after, 2 days after giving this speech, and another mom walked up to me, especially after 2 years of COVID, and she said, you felt exactly how I feel, and you made me realize I can fight again. And I think there's power in anger. But we have to be very intentional in the words that we use. I didn't at all attack my colleague back. I didn't call her a name. I talked about myself and my values and why people like me, who are generally okay, have to stand up for other people.
I was shocked to learn that you were an industrial arts major in college and that you designed cars for a while.
Yeah.
You're multi-talented, obviously. why did you run? You had this successful career. I mean, you were sort of like this up and coming star. Why did you decide? I mean, politics, people say, how can you get involved in that dirty business? Why did you run? Why did you run?
I was that person even a few years ago. But I've lived in 5 different states. I was born and raised in New Jersey, went to college in Indiana, built my career in California and New York, and then moved back to Michigan around 2014. My husband is a native Michigander, tons of friends in Michigan, and I owned my own business at the time, but I watched 2014 turn into 2015, turn into 2016. And in the 2016 election, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, but the fact that I watched my neighbors take down their American flag and put up a Trump flag just a few days after the Access Hollywood tapes leaked of this man bragging about sexual assault. And then a day or two after the election in Michigan, there was a video that went viral of 5th graders chanting, "Build that wall," at another 5th grader. And that video was from Royal Oak Middle School, which was my polling place. That's where I had voted just a few days before. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew that this type of politics was not okay. So I Googled how to run for office.
You Googled how to run for office?
Yeah.
You found a good site. I don't know what you found, but you found something good.
Shout out to She Should Run. They had a really great PDF specifically targeted for women. But I went through, I think, a lot of steps that a lot of people go through where you realize I want to help and I have no idea how. So I went to the Women's March in Detroit, and I'd never been a protester before. So I talked to friends who warned me, you got to write your phone number on your arm just in case they arrest you, and you have to bring milk in case you get maced. And it was sort of terrifying. But I went anyway, and what I found was joy. This was multiple generations of women coming together to find each other and to network and to exchange numbers and to talk about how we work together. And from there, it was just a series of events of starting activism and then figuring out where I best fit, finding a group called Emerge America, which recruits and trains Democratic women to run for office, and then going for it. And, saying,
and you got there.
And I got there.
And you definitely got there.
Yeah.
So did Sarah. Sarah, I want to ask you, because we're living in a time when transgender folks are being targeted by culture wars. They're being targeted by proposed laws to take away their health care. And you are the highest ranking transgender elected official in U.S. history. And I will ask you the same question, because you were a very successful activist. You worked in the White House. You were making progress doing what you were doing. Why would you get into the mud wrestling ring of politics?
Well, first off, it's great to join you all. It's great to be on this panel with so many heroes of mine. I am joining you from the 1st Senate District, the district that I was born and raised in. And the fact that I have this opportunity to serve it, the reason why I decided to run is because I love this community, and it has supported me and sustained me through some of the most difficult challenges in my own life. And I wanted to give back. One of the reasons why I got involved in advocacy and activism in high school and college was because I saw that politics is the place where every avenue of society converges and where you can make the most amount of change for the most number of people in the most number of ways possible. And while, to your point, I was doing that as an advocate, we still, for much of that time, had essentially no out transgender people in elected office, in state legislatures, which is the place where the rubber meets the road on public policy. And as people like to say, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. It is critical that we have diverse voices in government, both because it's a reflection of a healthy democracy. If you don't have the full diversity of a community represented in government, that means the full diversity of that community does not have equal access to all the different ways to participate in our democracy, but also because you can't craft effective solutions for diverse communities if you don't have the full diversity of those communities at the table. It's just a practical reality of policymaking. And so I ran because I wanted to give back to this community, but also because I knew at this moment in the fight for trans rights, while that wouldn't be my focus in the legislature, it was going to be critical to have people like me serve in public office, something that would have seemed impossible just a decade or two ago.
I want to ask you, because if you're going to change hearts and minds, you have to have some understanding as to why people think the way they think. And I want to hear you talk about why you think people are so opposed to acceptance for transgender people.
Well, I think there are a couple reasons. One is that the right wing needs boogie people. They need to fearmonger and they need to employ scare tactics. And over the last several years, it's become less effective to target gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, although it's certainly coming back with the rhetoric and the policies we're seeing now. But I think they needed new boogie people, and transgender people were a convenient next step for the far right wing to target. That's how they mobilize. That's how they seek to win elections. That's how they seek to keep progress from occurring. I think the second reason is that one of the challenges we face in the fight for trans rights is that most people who aren't transgender have a difficult time wrapping their minds around what it feels like to be trans and in the closet. When we're talking about gay rights, most people who aren't gay can understand what it feels like to love and to lust. And so they're able to enter into conversations around sexual orientation with an analogous experience. But cisgender people, non-transgender people, don't have the same kind of analogous experience. And for me, the closest thing that I can compare it to was a constant feeling of homesickness. But I think that lack of understanding creates fertile ground for people to buy the fear-mongering and the scare tactics that is coming, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so important that trans people share their stories, that trans families share their stories, so that people can enter into this conversation and understand that we are talking about real people who love and who face loss and who laugh and cry just like everyone else. And I think those two different factors come together to allow for, in this moment, transgender people to come under attack. But ultimately, I'll say that once they start their attack, I do believe the clock begins to tick on the effectiveness of that political attack. Because once you connect a vulnerable community with humanity, once you start that conversation, hearts and minds begin to open, and ultimately the folks who are coming for us sow the seeds of the destruction of the politics of hate that they seek to implement.
Wow. Kyle, you, this is going off in a slightly different direction, or very different direction, actually. You went undercover so you could report, it sounds very dramatic, but you spent years, actually, reporting out what's happening in terms of how conservatives are knocking it out of the park when it comes to bringing young people into their tent. What are they doing right?
Well, I think that contrary to popular opinion, conservatives actually have a very strong sense of educating, funding, supporting young activists. And a lot of times you find that left liberals sort of take their young people assume everybody's liberal, all young people are liberal, we don't need to help them, they are on our side. So because you saw conservatives over the years feeling like they needed to attract young people, they have developed lots and lots of organizations. They do incredible training. They do a lot of educating on philosophies and ideas. And they spend a tremendous amount of money on college campuses, which is where I first discovered them. I was writing mostly for the New York Times, doing lots and lots of education reporting. I heard so much about how left-wing students, progressive students were out of control on college campuses. And I began to see a lot of very well-funded right-wing groups on college campuses. And that got me really interested in what exactly was happening here and how were they getting supported.
You talked a little bit, I was fascinated about the intergenerational, where the older conservatives bring along the younger people. They actually try to share some of the messaging and sort of help them to become effective representatives. I mean, you make it sound like it's like Big Brother, Big Sister. I mean, is that what it's like? Is it?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because when I went to start my reporting, I actually told the young people that I was reporting on, I'm a Democrat. I voted for Democrats, but I'm fascinated by the type of work you're doing, and I'm impressed because I don't see this type of work on the left. And so I already started with a kind of relationship that was sort of simpatico. And what I found was that I was moved by the relationships that very, very conservative men and women whose ideas I really disliked, the relationship they had with younger people, how they would develop close relationships, fund them, train them. And I was moved by it. And nowadays, when I go and I'm increasingly moving away from journalism and more towards supporting groups on the left to do this type of activism, I tell them, you need to develop these very close relationships with your activists because they're your foot soldiers. They are the ones out in the field who are going to fight for you. And so you really need to have closer bonds with them. And I think everybody here tonight would agree with this. And because I see it in these incredible women, they activate not because they want to activate, they activate because they can't not. They can no longer sit on the sidelines. And I found that with these young people on the right, they were also activated. I saw them activated by fear, anxiety, things that I believed to be untrue, but they too were incredibly passionate. And that's across the board, no matter what you believe in.
I think at this point, I want to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that activists have. And Shannon, there's something that Harvard studied called the 3.5% rule, which is if you can engage 3.5% of the population in protests, you're almost guaranteed to make change, except when it comes to gun safety. Because you've got an overwhelming majority in this country, a lot of bipartisanship behind this issue, and yet we've seen time and time again until the first legislation that was passed last June, was it, I think, first in 30 years where they've actually gotten something through. Is that the biggest obstacle, is the legislating part of this?
Well, look, this is a section of activism or an issue where you had one of the most powerful, most wealthy special interests that's ever existed in this country have really a 30-year head start. And so a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the messaging, and even lawmakers who they had cultivated, they had on their side and in their favor going into this battle, which is what it has really been. And so some of that had to be undone. And some of it was really just about educating people about the need to use their voices and their votes on this issue, that they needed to become essentially single issue voters, and that if their candidate or lawmakers weren't on the right side of this issue, then they shouldn't vote for them. And that takes a long time, right? When I started doing this work back in 2012, about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress, Democrats, I said, had an A rating from the NRA. That is in part why major legislation failed just months after the Sandy Hook school shooting, was because we even had Democratic senators voting against it. We felt our job was to show lawmakers, if you do the right thing, we'll have your back. And if you do the wrong thing, we'll have your job. That doesn't happen overnight, right? That takes years and years of activism, showing up at every single gun bill hearing, creating relationships with lawmakers regardless of political party, and holding these lawmakers accountable for their records when it came to election time. And so here we are now, 10 years later. Not a single Democrat in Congress has an A rating from the NRA. In fact, many of them are very proud of their F ratings. As you mentioned, we just passed the first federal legislation, in large part thanks to Senator Chris Murphy, who I think is in your audience. And that's really the first bipartisan legislation on gun safety that's been passed in a generation. We had 15 Republicans sign on. So that's a significant, if not seismic, shift in American politics. And I would just kind of go back to this idea of polling. Gun safety is not a partisan issue. I'm not sure there's any issue in this country that has more support than stronger gun laws, regardless of political party, regardless of whether you're a gun owner, regardless of whether you're a man or woman. This has overwhelming support in this country. The only place that it is partisan is among some of our extremist lawmakers who sit in Congress and also in state houses across the country. And so it is really on all of us, again, to use our voices and our votes to get those people out of office and to show that there are consequences for voting against something the vast majority of Americans want.
I'm guessing that Mallory is relating to some of this because I know you tried to get, in your state house, you were trying to introduce legislation a year ago before the horrible shooting at Michigan State University. And what happened?
Yeah, I mean, Shannon is nailing it in these conversations, all of me thinking about the huge difference between, I think, activism, which is constant, and campaigning. And I think too many times when we're focused on the campaign, that if we just get the person elected and into office who we like, who agrees with us on our issues, we're done. I can tell you right now, so in the past few weeks have been really hard. We had a mass shooting at Michigan State, which is just 4 miles away from our state capital. And this week, we had our first hearings in my entire time in the legislature, and probably in decades, on gun violence, gun safety reform. Bills that would require universal background checks, safe storage, and create red flag laws. But I can also tell you, as an elected official, even though we know, for example, universal background checks, 93% of Republican primary voters who own a gun support universal background checks. That was polling that the Glenn Gariff group just did in Michigan. Staggering numbers. But over the past week alone, I have heard more from people opposed to this issue every single day on Twitter, in my email, on the phones, in a threatening way, in I'm taking their rights away, than people who support it. So I think that that's something that we have to recognize. Activism is this constant work. It is constantly communicating, constantly getting out there, building those relationships, because if you don't, and then you're frustrated saying, oh, I voted for the person who is good on this issue, but then you're silent, it allows that small minority of voices to come through and come through the loudest, especially in a state like Michigan.
Sarah, it actually is talked about that you can have a great bumper sticker, you can have a great slogan, but if you don't have a clear vision of what you want the future to be in terms of change, you really don't have much. And in your case, you ran on something that came from a very personal place, which was watching your late husband, Andrew, battle terminal cancer. And out of that, the issue of the importance of healthcare and family leave emerged. Talk about that, because you ran on something that people relate to. Talk about why you did that.
When I was running, I made clear that the most formative experience in my life is not being transgender. It was serving as the caregiver to my husband, Andy, during his battle with what ended up being terminal cancer. And during that battle with cancer, Andy was lucky. He had health insurance. We were both lucky because we had access to flexible workplace policies like paid family and medical leave that allowed Andy to focus on the full-time job of getting care that would hopefully save his life. And me able to focus on the full-time job of being there by his side to suction his tracheostomy tube, to tend to his wounds, to change his feeding tube bag. And ultimately, when Andy found out it was terminal, paid family and medical leave benefits allowed us to spend that precious time together, for us to get married just 4 days before he passed away. And for me to be able to be there by his side to walk him to his passing. And up until Andy's last moments, even as he faced death, he considered himself lucky because he had access to benefits, to coverage, to care that is far too uncommon here in the United States. We are the only industrialized nation in the world that doesn't provide some form of paid family and medical leave to workers. And so when I ran, I made clear that it shouldn't be a matter of luck. It should be the law of the land. And just this past year, about a year and a half into my first term, the governor signed my legislation, Senate Bill 1, which guarantees up to 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to Delaware workers, because we can't stop all loss or all pain as elected officials. but we can make life a little bit easier for people when they face inevitable hardship in life.
Sarah, I asked Shannon earlier, I'm going to ask you now, because I'm listening to you, and you know, you're in my heart already listening to you, and I wonder how you get through something that's that grueling when you're in the public eye. And do you ever say to yourself, you know what, I can't do this anymore?
Yes. One of the experiences that I had during the last month of Andy's life gave me a totally new perspective on things. And frankly, it's a perspective that I draw on now in my work, but also right now, just in this moment in our country when it can feel like we have every reason to give up hope. And that experience was in the last couple of weeks. My brother, who's a radiation oncologist and who's watched far too many people pass away from cancer, said to me, the next couple of weeks are going to be incredibly difficult, but you should take stock in the acts of amazing grace that will fill your life. And that grace, those miracles were everywhere, from our friends and family organizing a wedding for us in just 5 days to Andy surviving long enough to make it to our wedding. And what that experience reminded me and taught me really is that all of us, even in the most difficult challenges, we can all bear witness to acts of amazing grace, that hope as an emotion, hope as a phenomenon, it only makes sense in the face of hardship. And it's through acts of grace, it's through unending hope. Yes, it's through the righteous anger that you talked about with Mallory at the start, that people have actually been able to persevere challenges that in the moment seemed insurmountable, challenges that in the moment they couldn't actually see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is, I think, how we feel in this moment in our country. You can't tell us if we do X, Y, or Z that it will work. And for the first time, I think in many people's memories, that's not possible to know that we'll reach the light at the end of the tunnel. But if you actually look at history,
right,
every previous generation at some point has faced a challenge, whether it was the Civil War or the Great Depression, where they couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they persevered, they summoned hope, and ultimately they found the light.
Kyle, can you speak at this point?
Oh my gosh, that is so beautiful. I'm so awed to be here with these women. You know, just unbelievable activists, and I have hope. I have a lot of hope.
Well, I want to ask about the hope that these young people who you actually wound up liking have, because they also have much more tolerance than maybe some of the older counterparts for LGBTQ rights and for privacy issues and contraception and things that don't necessarily play with maybe some of the older counterparts. How does that work in terms of conservatives meeting their needs on that sort of thing?
It's a great question. I think the reason that we can have some hope here is that these folks, these extremists, and I love the way Shannon refers to these folks as extremists, because I think that really clarifies what we're talking about here. We're not talking about Democrats, we're not talking about Republicans, we're talking about extreme people who are really led by hate. And those folks are really they're picking from the bottom of the barrel. They're trying to figure out, how can I incite rage, anxiety, hate, fear in other people? And what they're fighting is this generation of young people who are more inclusive and more searching for equality and more generous and hopeful than any generation we've had in the past. And so when we see these extremists be so angry and so intent on their gun laws and so intent on pushing down members of the LGBTQ community, we know they're doing that because this is the last cry for them. And so that's where I have hope, is this generation, and knowing that this rage is really coming from trying to find something to get people to not want this openness and this inclusive.
But how do the younger conservatives
How do they do that?
Yeah,
they message well. I mean, that's where when I talk to progressives and I talk to Democrats, the thing I talk to them about is how well one can message hate, and that hate is a very easy sentiment to message, and it can be very activating. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that it actually costs a lot of money to create these social media campaigns. These aren't as organic as a lot of people think. And so the Democrats, left progressives, leftists need to get better at sending these messages that Sarah, that Shannon, that Mallory are talking about, this message of hope, this message of kindness, this message of we're all in this together. These folks need to get much better at sending those messages and spending the money you need to spend online and with activist groups and with candidates to get that message out.
Shannon, one of the things that has changed over the course of the last 10 years, because I'm somebody who, like many folks, lives 20 minutes away from Newtown, and I remember very vividly coming home and saying to my husband, listening to what happened on the radio, and I said, now it's going to change. Now it's this will do it. You know, it was like the certainty, and I'm sure many people felt the same way. And even if you were angry, what happened back then 10 years ago is people tended to be, they were sad. They were putting themselves in the place of the parents who lost children. It wasn't about the rage. It wasn't about the anger that activates people to go and vote. And as just happened in the last elections, candidates who were soft on gun safety were punished at the polls in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Colorado. So the difference maybe has something to do with how people have changed. Is that part of it as you see it?
You know, I actually think, I don't think that in any case in this country, people are numb to gun violence. I can't imagine any parent who would be okay thinking they could send their kids to school and they may not make it home, right? Or send their kids out to play and they may not make it home. I think we're traumatized as a nation by gun violence, but I also think what we needed was for people to mobilize. You know, when the Manchin Toomey bill failed in April of 2013, that's the federal bill I mentioned, that failed by a handful of Senates in the vote, including some Democratic senators. It would have closed the nation's background hole. One of the U.S. senators, a Democrat, Heidi Heitkamp, said the reason she was going to vote against closing that loophole was because she was hearing from her constituents 7-1 against the bill. We were just 6 months old, but I remember saying to my fellow volunteers, we will never let that happen again. Lawmakers can be cowards and they can do the wrong thing, but they will never, ever be able to say again that it was because they didn't hear enough from their constituents. And in fact, when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed this summer, one of the Republicans who voted for it, my former senator, Senator Todd Young, he's a Republican in Indiana, and he said the reason he was going to vote for the bill was because he was hearing from his constituents 10-1 in Indiana in favor of voting for it. So I really do think what it took was an organization or a movement, frankly, that could come in and mobilize people to call and send emails and show up in their polling places, just like the gun lobby had done for decades and decades. Again, they had a 30-year head start.
I've heard you talk about when people feel powerless and helpless, and the reality is that we're really not, even though we think we are. How are we not?
This story is the exact example. You know, what Shannon has done is an incredible example of that, and everybody who's joined Moms Demand Action. I am somebody who, the older brother of one of my closest friends in high school was shot and killed in the Virginia Tech shooting. And I remember how powerless we all felt. I watched it play out over and over and over again on CNN in these animated reenactments of how the shooter got in and what happened. And even though, you know, it was kind of a step removed from me, just how devastating it felt. And the difference between then and in the wake of Parkland, I was a first-time political candidate, and I got an email from high school kids demanding to meet with me at 8 a.m. on a Sunday at a Starbucks to talk about gun violence. And that shift, I mean, for even somebody like me who was running for office specifically on this issue and other issues, it made me push harder, because I think what all of us are saying is ultimately people want to be a part of a group that supports them and can move forward. We are not powerless because this shows the progress, how much change we can make, how much pressure we can put on. The fact that these kids, in the wake of watching something traumatic, didn't feel powerless. They knew to email somebody who was running for office. The fact that in the wake of the Oxford High School shooting, on the same day of that shooting, when I think conventional wisdom would say this community is going to need some time and some space to go through mourning, I got outreach that day from an Oxford dad who said, hell no, you don't get to wait. What do we need to do to organize around this and make change? Because this never should have happened here. It never should have happened in Parkland. There should not be a national community of people who have gone through this. And people know that they can and should take action and continue to push and continue to push. And it might take time. You know, you mentioned John Lewis at the top. Right. This is somebody who spent his entire life fighting for the same issue. It's not going to change. It's that lifetime of activism and staying involved that shows that we're not powerless. It's a constant push and pull.
I actually just looked at the clock and realized we're almost out of time, so I have a quick question for each one of you, and I want to ask you one more thing, Mallory, which is that you've talked about how, you know, women and families aren't always treated so well in the society, and having your daughter Noah was a revelation because you wondered if you could do it, you know, have the career in the family. And recently, you decided not to run for retiring Senator Debbie Stabenow's seat in Michigan. Why? You have national following. Why did you decide not to run?
That's not the point of this job. The idea that somehow federal office is a promotion. I cringe when people say higher office. I did this to make change in my community. And in this opportunity where we have right now with majorities in the legislature that we have not had in my entire lifetime, with my daughter, with my family, where I can do this thing I set out to do, that's what I'm going to do. And we have to promote, whether you're running for a school board or city council or you're being involved in an activist group, there is no position that is more important or less important. We need good people in all of these positions doing this work, and then we're going to make the change that we want to see.
But maybe someday you'll run for senator. Never mind. I'm sorry. Okay. Kyle, I'm sorry, because we are almost out of time on this segment, but what do you want people to take away in terms of, you know, conservatives are really good at the long haul. There's no, you know, immediate gratification there. What do you want people to take away?
I want them to take away the fact that what young people want, what families want, they want community. They want a place, a political home, a social home, a home where they can be with other people who share their values. So if Democrats, progressives, leftists can create those homes where people can share values and be together in community and then activate on the causes that they care about, that's going to be a winner program for them.
Okay. Shannon, I'm going to ask you, because you have left the organization. I don't think you're ever retiring. I don't see that as a word that actually fits in with your profile at all. Where is the next project for you?
Well, I'm with Moms Demand Action through the rest of the year. You know, I really feel strongly that a founder role is finite. I helped create the place for people to meet, but it's really the people who are in that space who make the difference. I'm a full-time volunteer, and I have been for a decade. That's a long time. And so I think by stepping back at the end of this year, it enables other people to step forward with new and wonderful energy and ideas. I don't know what's next for me. I'm not sure. I'll figure that out after maybe a vacation or two. But I will be certainly a Moms Demand Action volunteer here in the state of California and cheering everyone on from the sidelines.
I want to thank you for your service. I'm going to give Sarah the last word here, because in your incredible TED Talk, which I highly recommend to people to watch, you talked about how when you were a child growing up, you would pray every night to wake up as a girl, because you wanted to be your authentic self and you wanted your family to be proud of you. And you came out to your family and your friends, and they are proud of you. And yet the thing everybody wants to know, are you happy?
I am happy. I am fulfilled. I am joyful. I am lucky. And I just want to build a world that's a little bit kinder so that more people can be happy and joyful in the same way that I'm able to be right now.
And if only we could clone you all. I don't even know what to say. I think just thank you all to this panel because inspiration doesn't begin to cover it. Earlier today, we have one more segment. I spoke with my next guest, who, when it comes to music, is as comfortable leading a church choir as she is on stage at Carnegie Hall. As a Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter, she's performed all over the world using the power of music to bring people together, to heal and to effect positive change. Melanie DeMore, you are the perfect person to wrap up this show on the power of us, and we're delighted to have you with us today. I'm going to start right off the top by asking you something. Did a little research on you, and I want to know how somebody who was a chef, an actor, a forklift operator, and a nun winds up being a vocal activist. How does that happen?
Well, the thing is that the music has always been the main thread throughout all of this. So even when I was driving the forklift, I was singing. When I was in the mother house, I was singing. All of my life, it's been so much a part of me. And people always ask me, they say, what do you do when you're not singing? And I go, I don't understand the question.
It's just that much. It's like breathing to you, I think.
Yes, ma'am.
So you are equally at home on stage, whether it's the Kennedy Center or, as we mentioned earlier, Carnegie Hall. But at the same time, you are out among people, and you are part of something called the Threshold Choir, which means that you can be found performing at the bedside of somebody who's in hospice care. Explain that mix to us.
Well, it's a very different way of singing, and it's not really performance. It's song as service. And the Threshold Choir was founded by a woman named Kate Munger in Inverness, California. And understanding the power of music and song as food and nourishment. And so when I'm called to sing at someone's bedside, it's my role there is to make a place for them to be and their families to be so that they can do whatever it is that they need to do in order to make their transition. And as an aside, the first funeral I ever sang at was my own mother's when I was 19.
I didn't know you sung at the funeral of your own mother.
Yeah. I wrote a song and sang it at her funeral when I was 19. So it began early.
You, from the get-go, were compared to a woman who was called the voice of the civil rights movement, Odetta. And you later shared the stage with her. And I watched a performance of her doing This Little Light of Mine. And she said something interesting, which was that it's not the darkness that we're afraid of, it's the light that we're afraid of. Explain that to us.
Well, that's absolutely true. It takes so much less energy to hate someone. That fear, it takes a lot more energy to maintain your focus on love. It's so much easier to hate. It really, really is. And so that light is something that people have a fear of. You know, they want to stay in the darkness, in the shadows and all of that. But we have to think about all the different kinds of light. You know, for instance, without the black and the darkness, you couldn't see the stars. And so our job out there is to make our light shine as bright as we can, because we live in a world that wants to keep that light dim.
What for you is the significance of that song, This Little Light of Mine? Because I know would you do it? Just do a few bars for us here.
Yeah, so I'll throw a little Gullah spin on it for you. From the Sea Islands, I'll put a little Gullah rhythm into it. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. You know that this little light, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. The thing about that is that we say, I'm going to let it shine, which means that you as an individual person are making a pledge that no matter what, I'm going to let my light shine. That's what I'm going to do. All around the world, I'm going to let it shine.
You make a contention that the songs of your ancestors, our ancestors, are as timely today as they were back then in terms of motivating people, in terms of comforting people, in terms of being the soul, the heart of a protest movement. Talk about the song "We Shall Overcome."
Oh, that song. You know, it's really an interesting thing about that song. That song is sung literally all over the world. And the particular arrangement that a lot of us sing is the arrangement sort of that Pete Seeger came up with. And I had the pleasure of touring with Pete for a while. Bless that guy's heart. And he was a person who believed in everybody's having a voice. And that song is a song that's about hope, and it's about longing, and hope is not an easy thing to hold, to maintain. And when you think about "We Shall Overcome," deep in my heart, it's faith, it's hope, it's focus, no matter what. You know, and I think about "We Shall Overcome" and the power of that song. I think about Brother John Lewis. I think about Cesar Chavez. I think about all of those folks who take the love of their people and keeping them on the path towards freedom and towards connection and towards being seen as true 100% human beings. You know, and we shall overcome someday. And that's not losing hope.
Take us through, if you would, again, a few lines, and I've heard you do this analysis that I don't think most people would make the connection. If you would sing a little bit of "We Shall Overcome."
I'll sing it sort of in my arrangement of it. Goes like this. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Yes. I always think about it in terms of having that minor feeling, because a lot of times we don't think about what we're really saying. You know, we sing songs that we know, but we don't stop and think, what are we really saying? What is our true goal? What is our intention? And when you think about those images of Dr. King walking shoulder and shoulder and side to side by every person in the color rainbow, what Dr. King understood was that it cannot change without all of us. And it's "we shall overcome," which means you, me, and everybody else. We are not afraid. We shall not bow down. But we cannot do that without each other. That's what's so amazing about it.
Do you think that there's been, I'm sure you would like to see more song in terms of Black Lives Matter and the movements that are so active today, because basically what you say is that songs help build community. We're almost out of time, but just talk about that for a minute.
Well, I mean, it's the one thing in the world, in all of the arts, song is the one thing that connects people the quickest. And you think about all of these movements, when people get scared or something, they just call up a song. All throughout, when the people were fighting against apartheid, what would keep you moving would be the songs. Would keep you moving together, and you couldn't do it by yourself. That's why work songs are so important, and all of those things, is that songs give you a little bit more courage and gives you the energy to take one more step towards whatever your goal is. That is the magic and the power of song.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to say that I think all of us could take another step if we had you next to us. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being the power of us and for joining us. And that's our show for today, which we hope has inspired you to get into some good trouble of your own. We want to thank all of our guests and you for joining us. Until we see you back here next time, we're going to leave you with Melanie D'Amour's Lead with Love. Take care.
You gotta put one foot in front of the other.